So we've looked at how the election process happens for most positions in the federal and some of state level. Now we're going to try to understand a very complicated process, which is unique to the United States of the Electoral College. And we're also going to look at how we select things that may be different than other nations, as we have a winner take all process, which really pushes two powerful parties, the Democratic and Republican system, a two party system, where in other countries they don't have a winner take all system. And we'll look at some other systems that are starting to be implemented in the United States and have been taken on in places like San Francisco and even Georgia, where they've moved away from uh, just a one person winner system. And then you guys have to make your own conclusion on which way to go. So, how do we win elections? So, one misperception people might have is that if somebody wins an election, they had the majority of the votes. That is not true. Not in America. It's not necessary. In the American system, you can have what's called a plurality. Plurality just means many candidates with a plurality, or the most out of many. Plural being many, so most of many is a plurality. Okay, so you do not have to have 50.1% to win a position in the United States. In fact, a president alone, Barack Obama, had won the majority twice. He is the only president in I think the last 30 to almost 40 years that's won a majority. Almost all presidents have won with a plurality. We're going to see if maybe Joe Biden can pull a majority. That would be unique. It's almost always a plurality of the popular vote. And we'll get into the Electoral College in a little bit. Now, Electoral College is only for the president, though. So a plurality is the most votes of the candidate, but less than a majority of 50.1% of the votes. Now, people do win with a majority. Like they'll win for the House of Reps or they'll win for the Senate with a majority. However, they don't have to have it. So in Missouri, a lot of times we have at least four parties that we vote on. And who tends to show up year after year is obviously the Democrats and Republicans, but also the Green Party, which is much more progressive than the Democrats, and the Libertarian Party, which is much more conservative than the Republicans. So they're much more laissez-faire, and the Democrats are much more or the Green Party is much more environmentalist and maybe more socialist in their what they want to socialize things that affect the environment and universal health care. More than 50% is called a majority, obviously, but the plurality is less than. So if you had 38% of the vote and the next candidate had 36%, we'll look at an example of that in a minute. That's a plurality. You win with the most of many. Now, another system has become very popular in America, and this is in other countries as well. It's starting to really pick up, and people are really talking about it. It's called a rank choice voting system, and this is interesting. We've just changed the rules of St. Louis City now that they actually can't even put the party's name of the person on the ticket anymore. So it just says their name. Like it'll say Lyda Cruson or Tashara Johnson or Tashara Jones, but it doesn't say that they're both Democrats. So that's an interesting process too, taking the whole party name out. But this is different, and I'm curious what you guys think about this. We could talk about it in class. So a ranked choice voting, how does it work? So let's say you have 3 people, or 4 people, or 5 people, or 6 people running for office. What you do is you get to rank the votes. So who's your first choice? Well, you give them a 1, obviously. Who's your second choice? You give that person a 2. And then who's your third choice? And you give that person a 3. It goes to the vote. If nobody can get a majority, okay, so this gets rid of the plurality system. That is very American. This idea that it's just whoever's got the biggest chunk. And that's also in the parliament too. Like parliamentary systems don't necessarily have to have a majority. If they make a big enough coalition, it's the party that has the biggest plurality that gets to choose the prime minister. In America, it's the party or person that has the most of many. But this is actually changed in San Francisco is one place that's used it, and Georgia's using it now as well. So they have 3 candidates, and what we've seen is candidates start to form coalitions, and they try to 2 and 3 will work together to try to make sure that one doesn't get a majority, and then if 3 wins, 2 promises to move her supporters behind 3. So if you don't get to 50%, if they get 50% or more, it's over. They get a majority, they're done. But if that doesn't happen, now it comes down. You can see on the graph, and what happens is they could do they're going to take the best 2 out of 3. Okay, they're going to tally the votes, and they're going to redistribute votes to eliminate the candidate that had the least amount. Okay, so whoever had the least amount of votes is out. They're eliminated. Now you come down to the best 2 out of 3 after the ranking. So now it's down to a 2-person choice, and then they have to get this way. Only 2 people can actually run in the very end, and then of those 2, who gets the 50% wins it. Does that make sense? So let's say it's 7 candidates. The top 2 of those 7 would, if nobody could get 50, if somebody gets 50%, it's all over. Whoever got the over 50% wins, 50 or more. But if they can't, it's the 2 people with the biggest pluralities. They run against each other, as opposed to just automatically starting out with you just have to pick the person gets the biggest chunk from the bat. This is an interesting approach. A lot of people really like this because it gives you more options. So you can be like, So like for example, in the city, St. Louis City is very progressive. So it's usually, honestly, while Republicans still run in the city, the progressives are the Green Party is kind of popular, but they've won before, but they don't win much. This might give third parties like the Green Party in the city more ability to move up in ranking and maybe get a chance to win with support from other groups than just a traditional. Well, the Democrat always wins because they're just going to have the biggest group from the beginning. I don't know what you think. Some people I've heard say, oh, there's no argument against this. It gives me more choices. Other people have said, well, yeah, but it's a lot more voting. So people might get tired of the voting, or it's making the system more complicated. But then you could counter with, well, then the true people that want to see this happen are going to show up to vote. There's many ways of thinking about this. So you see in some states, and even Utah is starting to take this on, and especially a lot of progressive areas like San Francisco, and in areas like Georgia, we just had a Democrat win, or he got the biggest plurality because the 2 conservatives split the ticket, and one of the conservatives left. So there's 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and the Democrat got 30%, but didn't get 50%, and neither of the Republicans could get over 50 or more. So now what happens is the Democrat's going to go against the Republican that did the best, and then they're going to go head to head, and we're going to see what happens in the final race. All right, so let's look at the plurality system we have in almost all places in America, though. So you could see, this has been around for a very, very long time, since the beginning. And you can see this really affected the Abraham Lincoln election. Actually, Abraham Lincoln became president of the United States because he had a plurality. He did not have a majority. He only had 39.8% of the vote when he beat John C. Breckinridge, who was a Democrat, Southern Democrat. Then you had John, and he was second. He had only 18.1% of the vote. And then Stephen Douglas, who voted, remember the famous Lincoln and Douglas debates that you'll do in classes, and you'll do, which is a formal way of debating, very popular in politics. He only got 29.5%, and then John Bell took another 12.5% of the vote. So what happened in the end is Lincoln, because he had the biggest plurality, became president of the United States. He got the most electoral votes. He did not have to win an outright majority. What happened is those 3 other guys, in a lot of ways, helped cause Lincoln to win. Now, if it was Douglas versus Lincoln, could it have been a totally different situation? And the chances are probably so. Like maybe Douglas would have won. But more conservative Breckinridge pulled votes away maybe from Douglas. And the Republican at the time, which Republicans are very progressive, like progressive Democrats today, Abraham Lincoln benefited from this. So there is a reason that you could say, well, maybe ranked choice voting isn't the best. Because, I mean, would Abraham Lincoln be, which probably is usually ranked as probably the best president in the history of America, would he have ever been president? That's a good question. I don't know. I have a tendency to lean that maybe not. I think that Breckinridge would have helped Douglas if he didn't exist, and that would clearly be over 40% of the people would support Stephen Douglas. And also, if you threw John Bell in there, it's probably a little more conservative as well. I mean, honestly, Douglas really could have won, right? Look at how much green, but the South, he carried the South, Breckinridge. So think what would happen. Lincoln had the biggest chunk, 39.8%, and that's all you need to win in most races in America still today, a plurality. All right, now let's look at the incumbent win. Why do they win at such rates? So we talked about 85% of incumbents win. So whoever's in office already is an incumbent. So in this election is President Donald Trump. President might be a little bit. Actually, president is still about 85% proportionally, or in terms of percentage wise. So if you ever have money and you're going to vote on a race, I would vote for the incumbent. That's the safest bet without even looking if they're a Democrat or Republican. Because it's really hard to knock somebody off office once they're in there. The money starts coming already. You've got businesses and people supporting them and benefiting from them, and now you have a new person challenging them, and they don't have any real power. They might be exciting and energetic, but they don't necessarily benefit anybody yet. And what have they done for anybody, or what could they do for anybody? So in the House of Representatives, constituents are often overwhelmingly of one party due to gerrymandering. Okay, remember, constituent is somebody that is represented by a rep. So I am a constituent of my Representatives Ann Wagner, the Republican. She won election, and then our senators are Josh Hawley. I'm a constituent of Josh Hawley. He represents me to the Senate. I'm his constituent. I'm somebody that's actually in his territory, the state of Missouri, where that senator is representing. And a person is represented in a district, okay? So you can see to the right, St. Louis and St. Louis County are really cut up. Really itsy bitsy tiny districts, too. Those are very small pieces of land. That tells you how heavily populated St. Louis City and St. Louis County are. Obviously, St. Louis City is more heavily populated in the county. And as you get further and further away from the city, you see the districts get bigger. That means there's less people out there. It's more woods, more space. But the closer to the city, the more concentrated. Even in the counties, the mid counties have much more people than like a west county is more spread out. Now, what causes some of the conflict and the debate where we've argued and discussed, and people argue all the time, is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is this idea that partisan or dominant party in power gets to redraw the congressional district boundaries every 10 years based on the census. That's why census is really important, and it's pretty nerve-wracking when I saw we just finished the census for 2021 to 2031 for the next 10 years, and I saw that there's places in St. Louis City only 30% of people are turning in their census. Well, what's going to happen if they literally can't get those people to turn in their census? They do not exist. So their representation, they'll have less representation. They'll have less federal and state funding and they'll spend less money on their schools and their roads and everything because they don't think those people exist. Why would they throw more money to an area with less people? Very dangerous. Where you better believe in more affluent areas, they fill out their census and they fill it out very accurate because they want the money to come to their area. But based on those census, what happens is every 10 years, this is in the Constitution. It's actually in under the Article 1, which tells us how we're supposed to create the voting system for the legislative branch. We have to recut the districts. And what happens in almost all states is gerrymandering. And Missouri is really interesting. We just voted to go back to gerrymandering. We had gone to a nonpartisan system where we just had essentially a geographer with no party affiliation recut the districts and just kind of cut it pretty randomly, not based on any party. Now we've given the power back to the governor. So our governor, who just got elected for the first time, is Republican Mike Parson. Parson is going to get to choose who is on the commission to recut the districts. And you better believe that as a Republican governor, he's going to choose people that are very pro Republican. And they're going to cut the districts to keep the Democrats in small, condensed areas and give them less districts to represent Democratic people in the House of Reps. And that's why people look at Missouri and they'll be like, oh my gosh, there's no Democrats in Missouri. It's not true. And they also works the opposite way. They might have these weird shapes. Look how strange the districts are cut. Very weird shapes and to benefit the Republicans, to get the maximum amount of Republican districts they can. And that's called gerrymandering. So the power of cutting the districts really changes everything. What you have to understand is cutting districts now is much better with analytics and everything else than it ever was before. Now, with computer programs and mapping programs, we could sit there and cut this stuff perfectly. I mean, we could cut these districts in a way that really strange shapes that would almost always allow one party to beat the other party. And both parties do this, Democrats and Republicans. If you go to a Democratic state, you'll see a lot of gerrymandering that helps the Democrats. Like there's some weird districts up in Chicago that help Democrats. And then you go to Republican states like Missouri, you will see that there's some strange districts and crazy shapes that really benefit the Republicans. And you can see here's our districts for the state. And look at this. Look how condensed the Democrats are. They're also in much more populated areas. You can see St. Louis City, the far right. Look how tiny these districts are. And then look at how big they are out in the rural areas. Look at District 1 at the top left corner and 4 on the right. It's like there's nobody there. But with 1 even, you could probably cut that district in a weird shape that it touches that one Democratic district up in northwest Missouri. And you could get enough Democrats into 1 to make it a Democratic run district. These are unopposed districts. That means that no Republican even runs against anybody in District 67 on the right. And 1 and 4 are Republican. There's no Democrat that runs against them because the districts are cut so well. Democrats aren't, there's no way they're going to win. It's almost a waste of time and money. And it's hard to figure out. Now, does it change over time? Yes, because they only get to do this every 10 years. And what happens is nobody can predict. They try to create, the models are getting much better, where we can predict how people are going to move based on how they've been moving into the area. Is the area becoming more Democrat? Is it becoming more Republican? We're getting better at that. And people are starting to move. We're finding out a lot of evidence that people are living and moving in the areas that based on their politics. So progressive people are tending to move to more Democratic progressive areas. Conservative people are starting to move out to more conservative areas. And like you think of St. Louis, you could have it all. In St. Louis, you could live in the Central West End in a skyscraper and you feel like you're in downtown New York with all the restaurants and stores and the grocery stores, and you can have whatever you want. Or if you want to live in St. Louis still, you go out to St. Charles, you can get more rural, more spread out country conservative area. Or you could go to North County and get more of an affordable house in a progressive area. I mean, you name it. You could live in a rich, wealthy progressive area like Clayton is very liberal, or you can live out in a very wealthy conservative area like Town and Country, or Chesterfield tends to be much more conservative. You can have it all, and people are moving to where their politics kind of match up. Now, why did the founding fathers even create this electoral college? Well, it's in Article 2, Section 1, because Article 2 of the Constitution tells us the president. Article 1 is the legislative branch. Article 2 is about the president. Section 1, right off the bat, they tell us why this is going to happen. It was to create and it was to insulate the government from the whims of a less educated public. First of all, I hate to say it, they thought that citizens weren't very educated. Remember, there was no public education back then, and they just kind of assumed people weren't even logical or reasonable enough to vote for good candidates, and they were better than them. We'll be honest. They probably felt they were superior. And remember, all these guys were wealthy and they had private educations, or they did some of them were the example would be like they're outside the boxes. Like Alexander Hamilton's kind of a strange one. He was essentially an orphan in the end, and he went to what is now Columbia University, which is one of the top law schools. Smart guy. But outside of an Alexander Hamilton, they were all very wealthy. George Washington, the first president of the United States, had married Margaret Washington. He was probably the wealthiest man in America when he was president. So they had good educations, or they were powerful people in the beginning. The electorates for each state is a number of senators and representatives for the state. So this is how we figure out the electoral college. You get your senators, and every state has 2 senators, and the number of representatives. So in Missouri, we have 8 districts, 8 representatives, and then of course we have 2 senators. So we get 10 electoral votes. Illinois has 20. California has, I think, 38. Now, where people get upset is California gets really upset. Well, why do they get upset? Because California only gets 38 electoral votes, but they're the most populated state. But if you go to Wyoming, that has 500,000 people, which is about as many people as there in St. Louis City, they get 3 electoral votes because they only have enough people for one representative, but they're guaranteed, because they're a state, 2 senators. So they actually technically get more representation in small states. But this also works in conservative states like Wyoming and progressive states, maybe like Connecticut, which tend to be much more Democrat. Or Rhode Island is not a big populated state, or Delaware tends to be much more Democrat. Does that make sense? So people get upset by this. But on the other side of it, the founding fathers liked part of this idea, thinking, someday or even now, this protects the interest of the small states. And remember, part of the Great Compromise, the small states wanted representation from the big states. Now, this is we have is what called is a winner takes all system, where the winner of that state just receives all the electoral votes. End of story. Whoever has the plurality. So if Donald Trump had only won 49% of the popular vote in Missouri, so it does matter you vote. It just, whether or not you're going to flip the state is where it matters. And that's why it gets very complicated. And it created this complicated system where politicians, and some people really like this. Small states are in states in the Midwest and areas where it's much more, I'm going to say, more in the middle politically. Like the Northeast is very Democrat, very progressive. The West Coast, California, very Democrat, progressive. The South is very conservative, pretty Republican. Northwest is very liberal. The mountain states are very conservative. So if where all the swing states are, and a swing state is a state that swing Democrat or Republican, they almost all tend to be in the Midwest. Like we've seen, with the exception of Pennsylvania, I would consider part of almost the Northeast. Pennsylvania, Ohio are the big swing. Michigan, and now Wisconsin, and even maybe someday in Minnesota are swing states. Now we're seeing some different things going on, where even Georgia, North Carolina, and the South are starting to change. More and more progressive people are moving into those areas, like Atlanta and Charlotte and Raleigh in North Carolina. And even Arizona is becoming much more progressive. There's younger people moving into Phoenix, and there's a larger Latinx population that tend to be much more Democrat. Actually, Bernie Sanders did the best with the Latinx demographic, much better than Joe Biden. And Nevada has become progressive because of the Latinx population. So, something to think about. I'm curious what your point of view is, and we'll discuss this in class. Now, why did they? We said that it was protect us from a ignorant population of citizens. They didn't trust the citizens themselves. They thought, hey, you know what might happen? You might have this really suave, charming person, like a populist, kind of really, emotional. People really react to emotion over logic. The guy's going to come in there and he's going to be the next king or dictator. Or I'm sure there wasn't fascism as we've known it historically yet. Remember, this is really the first democracy since the Roman Empire. But they did understand the Roman Empire, and they lost that democracy fell apart in Rome. The Senate collapsed, and the Caesar took over. And they went to basically an authoritarian power dictator for years and years and years. So they knew that, and they were scared that one day America would have an authoritarian fascist leader. And that the real reason that Electoral College is kind of this pull safe, that it's going to pull out the water out of the tub if this thing gets flooded. So if the dictator is about to really win the election, this really bad person, then they would they would vote against them. They'd actually vote against them. Um, and that's not necessarily how it's been used. It's made a system where, in some ways, people really like the idea that the founding fathers were maybe right, that these small states, the politicians are paying attention to them. Like, the politicians go out to Ohio and Michigan, which are not the most populated states, and Wisconsin's definitely not that big. Arizona, Nevada, and they go out there and they try to sell them, and try to get them to come in. So that has changed. Things have changed, and people like that. Um, but on the other side of it, if you're in California or New York, you're getting upset because or Florida too. We get less representation. We only have so many electoral college votes, even though we have much more people. Like, why does the guy in Wyoming get much more representation than me as a Californian? That's not fair. So there's a lot of arguments there. And originally, the whole system, it was actually in the Constitution under Article 2 for the president. But under the 12th Amendment, what happened is now they basically place one vote. They had two votes, and it caused big problems because there would be ties, and they had a tie, and there could be all these issues with the Electoral College. So they went to the 12th. They had to actually amend the Constitution to go down to two votes, but one for the president and one for the vice president now. So now tying is still possible, but it's pretty hard. You can have a 270-270 split. So you need 200, 269, I'm sorry, to 269 is a perfect split. But right now, if you get 270 electoral votes, you've won the election. You see that number? That's the magic number. All right, guys. See you next time.